Production of Springdale, Memories of a Lifetime, was made possible in part by Tom and Emily Luthi, with additional support from Jim and Lou Baldwin.
Stories practically reach out to you as you brush by the monuments in this cemetery. You find anecdotes of sacrifice and unexplained legends.
When they arrived, they found Fort Clark, which was partly demolished.
She was also the first woman to sit on the board of directors of a bank.
There are 2 Congressional Medal of Honor buried in Springdale.
There are mysterious yarns and folklore about money and power.
Large piles of stones or boulders were used in order to cover the graves so the deceased person could not rise out of the grave from beneath them.
He put a curse on Governor Ford, said that he would live with this curse the rest of his life.
When a cemetery is 150 years old, there are tales that weave a timeline of history, revealing a rich tradition. This is Springdale Cemetery, holding memories of a lifetime. Of the 6 men who first arrived in Peoria County in 1821, 2 stayed, Seth and Josiah Fulton. Josiah has remained all these years here in Springdale. Josiah, with brother Seth, came up the Illinois River from Kaskaskia, where their father ran a ferry boat on the Mississippi.
When they arrived, they found Fort Clark, which was partly demolished. It had been vacant for about 6 or 8 years. They found 2 log cabins that were partially burned, and so they rebuilt those 2 log cabins and lived in those log cabins and on the keel boat that they used to arrive here during the first year. Josiah made his living as a farmer. He bought the land by the courthouse. The land ran from about where the Commerce Bank building is today down to the river, and then somewhere south and a little bit north up by Fayette Street perhaps, and he farmed that land in the 1820s. Okay, after that he sold that land, and then in the late 1820s, early 1830s, he bought the land where St. Augustine Manor is now located, which at one time was Proctor Home, and that land he owned between Glen Oak and probably about Madison Street, between Spring Street and where Woodruff High School now stands. And he farmed that land until about 1834, when he sold that and moved way north out of Knoxville, and that land was between Forest Hill, War Memorial, Knoxville, and California Street. It's about 160 acres.
Josiah Fulton's descendants reside here, on that same land, more than 170 years later. His chair sits in the living room today.
Seth Fulton, his brother, was the first hotel keeper in Peoria. He owned a hotel, and I believe the name of it was the Peoria Hotel. It was on Water Street. I don't think it was very large, just a small hotel, and that was his business. Then his brother Sam got into the political world early on, and in 1825, Sam was elected the first sheriff of Peoria County.
Josiah's wife, Augusta, gave birth to the first European child in Peoria County, Nancy Jane Fulton, in 1832.
Governor Thomas Ford, a former Peorian, came from Ireland, and he came to first to Pittsburgh in this country, and then he moved over to Nashville, Tennessee, where he married an Irish girl they had never met before in Nashville. She was Irish also. And they got married there. They had 5 sons and 3 daughters. And later on, they moved to Peoria about 1838. In Nashville, he had a boot store, a boot and shoe store, which he moved to Peoria. But then he got a law degree, and he became an attorney in Peoria, and went on to become the judge of the Peoria Circuit Court. And after that, he became a member of the Illinois Supreme Court. When Ford became governor, Illinois was in bad shape. It had become almost bankrupt over the Michigan-Illinois Canal participation. And rather than file bankruptcy, Ford decided to solve the problem, and he, in 4 years, turned Illinois around, and it became solvent once more. And he's noted as one of the best governors we ever had with regard to money. Shortly before Governor Ford became governor, the Mormons moved into Nauvoo, Illinois, and the Smith brothers, Joseph and Hiram, started their church there. And it was at that time, in those days, this was not a welcome church in the area. The other Christians were not believers in what they brought to Nauvoo. So they had a rather dangerous life there. While they were in Nauvoo, they had a fight with the newspaper there and threatened to burn it down. And so they threw them in the Carthage, Illinois jail. And it's there where some of the people with their faces blackened came in and killed both brothers. Before Joseph Smith died, he put a curse on Governor Ford and said that he would live with this curse the rest of his life. And so after the Smiths died, Governor Ford came back to Peoria, had ill health. His wife also had ill health, and a friend took them in because they were practically paupers at the time. And he tried to practice the legal profession again in Peoria, but his appearance and the way he dressed just wasn't appropriate. And so he didn't make any great money at it, so he decided to change courses, and he wrote a book about the history of Illinois. And after he died, that book was published. He died practically a pauper. His estate was $146.06.
Norman H. Purple was a prominent local attorney in the 19th century. He was associated with many well-known Peoria attorneys such as George Metcalf and Alexander McCoy. He had many achievements. His most notable achievement was being appointed justice to the Illinois State Supreme Court by Governor Thomas Ford in 1845. He then moved to Quincy, Illinois to perform his duties with the State Supreme Court. Upon his return to Peoria in 1848, he continued making major contributions in the field of law. One of his most notable came in 1856 with the publication of his compilation of the general statutes of the state of Illinois, which are known as the Purple Statutes. In the years that followed, he frequently traveled to Chicago to attend sessions of the U.S. Circuit Court, and in fact he died at the Sherman House in Chicago, August 9, 1863. His body, of course, was brought home to Peoria for burial here on Vista Hill in Springdale Cemetery. In the family plot, the judge, his wife, Anne Eliza, and 3 of their 6 children and 1 grandson are buried here. The markers themselves are highly unusual. As you notice with the tombstone marking the graves of the judge and his wife, they're raised above the grave level off of the ground. They're shaped in the form of a casket. The judge and his wife, the monument has elaborate carving and a Roman cross on the top. It's also composed of the mineral or sandstone, and that's somewhat unusual. The 2 sons, which are buried over here to the side, Charles and William, also have raised sandstone markers, and they died at early ages. One was 29 years old, the other only 34. The carving, though, is not the same as on their parents' marker. It has a willow or hickory wooden cross carved into the top of the monument for each of the burial sites, and no other decoration on the sandstone. The rock pile is very unusual that sits to the back of the grave site. There is no burial beneath it, but since 3 of the children died elsewhere, it's more than likely a memorial to these family members who couldn't share the spot as their final resting place. Historically, large piles of stones or boulders were used by people who were very superstitious in order to cover the grave so the deceased person could not rise out of the grave from beneath them.
A walk through Springdale Cemetery can be much like visiting an open-air art gallery. Statues and ornate carvings reflect the influence of the families buried here. Many of the old monuments in Springdale were created by Otto Triebel and Sons Company. Otto's son, Fritz, would become an internationally famous sculptor in the late 1800s. Fritz Triebel created what may be the finest piece of art in Springdale, the Statue of Peace. It is part of the monument commissioned by Peoria department store owner Frederick Block. A sculptor from a later era was Joseph Petardi, whose simple marker belies his actual talent.
Petardi was born in a family that came from an area in Italy where they were all stone carvers. And his father was a stone carver. And when the Petardi family moved to Rome, that is where Joseph was born. And he started carving at about the age of 5. And his father, of course, was a professional carver. And he ran away from home when he was about 14. They found him, took him back, and then later on he left and went to Paris and worked there for 2 or 3 years, I think. And then went to New York and lived with a brother in New York and started carving in New York. And then he got to Peoria by being hired by a riverboat captain by the name of Alexander Partridge, who gave the land for the Upper Free Bridge, which was north of the McCluggage Bridge. And so he was hired by Partridge and came to Peoria to carve the Joliet limestone for the Upper Free Bridge. And he lived with the Partridge family, and then later married a daughter, and then stayed here in Peoria. He worked in places like Galesburg and Bloomington and around the various parts, but he spent the major part of his life here. Well, I guess he was a rather quiet man, and he also had quite a sense of humor, which I think was brought out on the carvings on his house. He kind of had liked some of the rather slightly bawdy things that he had also carved. The lions, I understand the neighborhood children loved the lions and they used to play on the lions, but the neighbors weren't terribly fond of the supports for the porch. There are two partially nude women and Atlas holding up his shorts, and they were a little bit offended by that.
The McCluggage Bridge replaced the upper Free Bridge on which Petardi worked. The current bridge eventually was named after Peoria Mayor David McCluggage. But at first, some city leaders wanted to name it after aviation pioneer Octave Chanute.
Octave Chanute is known as the father of American aviation. His father taught history at the Academy of France, Royal Academy of France. And when Chanute was 6, his father came to America to teach in New Orleans. And they wound up in New Orleans and New York and Chicago and elsewhere. And he finally came to Peoria, I presume because he married a Peoria girl. His experiments with gliders, he didn't start this until he was 60. He must have been almost ready to retire. And he would be up at the dunes along southern shore of Lake Michigan where Gary is now. And he made hundreds and hundreds of flights with gliders, kept it expanding and perfecting them, and I guess they've got to be really good. And the Wrights based their first gliders on Chanute's designs and experiments, so he sort of influenced the Wrights, and he was there for the first flight and all that sort of thing. Interestingly, Chanute predicted airplanes would be used to carry mail, to carry passengers, and to as a part of warfare. And Chanute Field was started and opened in 1917 to train American pilots for World War I, which was the first war in which airplanes really played any part whatsoever.
There is not much to mark Chanute's life in Peoria, just one short road and these small markers for him and his wife at Springdale. While Chanute was known as the father of aviation, his contemporary, John Warner, was called the founder of modern Peoria.
John Warner came to Peoria with his mother and father and 7 brothers and sisters. His father was in the hotel business and managed the Clinton House, which was at the corner of Adams and Fulton Street. It was a well-known hotel, one of the first in Peoria. John went to Peoria Public Schools for a period and then became a clerk in his father's hotel. After he had been a successful merchant in Peoria for a number of years, he sold men's wear. He organized an Irish regiment when the Civil War started and became their colonel. And this group of servicemen were in the siege of Vicksburg and at a place called Chickasaw, which is near Vicksburg. When he first returned to Peoria, he was appointed postmaster, but he apparently did not enjoy this work because he resigned that position and became a wholesale liquor dealer. Now, you recognize that liquor was big business in Peoria in that era. He was mayor for 13 years over a 25-year period beginning in 1874. He was the first mayor to have served this long a period of time. And during his term in office, he brought about a number of improvements for the community. For example, he reorganized the fire department, making it what was then considered to be an outstanding metropolitan department. He put uniforms on policemen. Apparently they had not had a consistent uniform before this time. And maybe most important among his contributions is that he was mayor when the present City Hall was built.
Warner's body sits atop Vista Hill in Springdale. He served the most years as Peoria's mayor in the 19th century. The very first mayor of Peoria was William Hale. He was one of a group of early city founders who now rest here in Springdale Cemetery.
After the Civil War in 1865, Peoria began to recognize their founding fathers with their stories in history books like this from 1873, with magnificent pictures and tales of what they went through in their pioneer days. And you walk through Springdale Cemetery and you realize that most of our founding fathers are buried right here. There's Gardner Barker, Elliott Callender, Benjamin Borland. There's the great industrial pioneers, Robert Avery, Martin Kingman. But the one that they recognize the most, as they're revered and honored in all the history books, is John Hamlin. John Hamlin came to Peoria in 1821. He found 2 log cabins here and he set up our first American trading post. He started our first business, which was pork packing, and he was the first person to own a steamboat that ran the Illinois River. He went on to become our first Justice of the Peace, our first city alderman. He became our first Illinois state representative and our first Illinois state senator. Now, when Peoria County was formed in 1825, Chicago was part of Peoria County for 6 years. So all of the first birth certificates, death certificates, and marriage certificates in Chicago all bear John Hamlin's signature.
Many pioneers made their living on the Illinois River, such as George Bester, a riverboat captain who also served as mayor in the 1850s and as postmaster of Peoria. Another early river enthusiast was Henry Detweiler, who came here in 1837 from Lorraine, France. He started training as a riverboat pilot when he was 15 and offered his skills during the Civil War.
And he apparently did a lot of, transporting materials and even horses. There was something about he had transported $25,000 worth of horses. And it was hazardous duty, him going through the riverways and, during the Civil War, but he was very successful, never lost a ship and everything. So, and plus he knew Abe Lincoln. And he got to know him just during their riverboat travels because Abe Lincoln would go up and down the Illinois. And plus he had other friends too, P.T. Barnum. And he's just a fascinating romantic character. He is someone that we think of a riverboat pilot. The curly, unruly hair, I guess, and the goatee. Every photo of him shows him with this goatee. It looks exactly the same from the youngest photo to the last ones that we have of him. Yeah, Henry was a man, true riverman in more ways than one. When he wasn't going down the steamboats down the river, then he was collecting ice during the winter, storing it in the summer, and had quite a lucrative ice business back in 1870, which he started with Nelson Woodruff, who was Mayor Woodruff's father. The two of them split, though, a few years later, and so those 2 dominant names come up in Peoria history as far as the 2 big ice companies, the Detweiler Ice Company and the Woodruff Ice Company. So everything was built around water, whether it was liquid or whether it was frozen. He and his wife, Magdalene, he married her here in Peoria, and she was also from the same part of France that he was from. And they luckily met here and married in 1848. They had 7 children, and 4 of them died before he died in 1903. And there's names on every one of the stones out here because all 7 of their children are buried with Henry and his wife, but his wife, Stone, does not have her given name, which is very ironic when you go through and look at it. But that says a lot for the time period too. Beloved wife, because a lot of it was based on the man who had the stature in the family. But she died in the 1880s, and some of the reports that he was devastated by her loss, and of course they had a lot of tragedy in their life. His son took the time, Thomas, gave the Peoria Park District 140 acres back in 1927. Now this was way, way up north of the city. Everybody thought, what a waste of time and money and a donation to the community. But Thomas picked that area, which we know now as Detweiler Park, because it overlooked the river, which his father would have loved. And out of that has grown, Detweiler Drive, Detweiler Golf Course, Detweiler Marina. You can't get away from it, and that is, it's as dominant a name as I think Bradley is here in the community.
Shortly after Springdale was chartered, Lydia bought a large site in the cemetery, large plot of land, and one of the things she did was to move her father from the Old City Cemetery to Springdale, and she did that in 1859. Tobias was originally involved in partnerships with Lydia's brother, William Moss, who was already in Peoria and quite a successful businessman in a number of ventures. With William Moss, Tobias became involved in lumber mills, a distillery, what later became the Peoria and Rock Island Railroad. In fact, William Moss at one time had purchased a riverboat which Tobias piloted up and down the Illinois River, earning a pretty substantial income for hauling freight. So really, I guess, you could say Tobias Bradley apprenticed under William Moss and developed a lot of his shrewdness in business, and he also encouraged Tobias to get into land speculation, both residential and commercial property. When Tobias died rather suddenly in an accident, it would have been expected at that time that Lydia, as a widow, would have simply lived in genteel obscurity and simply collected the income accruing from the established investments and businesses. And she was really very unusual for her time because she did not do that. As a matter of fact, over the course of the rest of her life, she quadrupled the estate by getting into a lot of things Tobias hadn't gotten into, particularly in residential and commercial property. She got into land development, tenant farming, really showed quite a knack for reclaiming land that people would have thought could never have been productive. She was also the first woman to sit on the board of directors of a bank in Illinois, and there is some thought that she may have been the first in the country. One of the provisions in Lydia's will was for the regular placement of flowers on her grave and Tobias's. That may have been because Lydia was an avid amateur gardener, maintained a very large garden in the back of her home, and was always raising and experimenting with varieties of flowers. So despite the fact that it was a common enough custom, it may have kind of had a special place in her heart. So the provision was made in her will, and from that time thereafter, the Polytechnic Institute, later the university, regularly places flowers on Lydia's grave during the season in which fresh flowers are grown, and then places other appropriate ornamentation on the graves during holidays, or perhaps a wreath at Christmas, that sort of thing.
Lydia Moss Bradley wasn't the only female to make a mark during the 19th century. Lucy Brotherson Ting, the daughter of a mayor, was the first female elected to a school board in the state.
Civil War had such a great impact on the whole country, and Peoria was no different. Lucy was old enough at the time to be involved in many different societies. There was the Ladies Soldiers Aid Society of Peoria, which helped serve dinners to soldiers that would come through town. And about midway through the war in 1863, the organization changed names and became the Women's National League. And Lucy was very active in that society also. And they would help soldiers that came through town. They would help the families that were living in Peoria to get by, because it was very hard to exist without the husband providing a living. They also opened a soldier's home here in Peoria, a Soldier's Rest home, and she was very active in that. there were several women in Peoria that felt so compelled to honor these men that they were able to raise funds to put a memorial monument up on Soldiers Hill right here in Springdale Cemetery. And they were very excited about that because they wanted these men to be remembered for what they had done to help save our country. In 1899, President McKinley and I think every member of his cabinet except one came to Peoria to help dedicate a new monument to the Civil War soldiers in Peoria County. October 6th of 1899, they came to the Peoria Courthouse Plaza and dedicated this wonderful monument that is still there today. And Lucy was very active in raising funds. In fact, what she did was she went around to the schools and the children collected their copper pennies, and that's a good amount of the funds were raised by doing that, by involving the school children. She did serve on the school board. She was elected with no opposition at all, which, if you think about it, that's really something to achieve that, especially in the day and age when this happened with her. It was very unusual. In fact, she was probably the first woman in the whole state of Illinois to be elected to the school board. She served very faithfully on the school board. People thought a lot of her. She was very highly respected in the community, and after her death, a school was dedicated in her honor with her name on the school building.
Time has taken a toll on the monument for which Lucy Ting raised money. While it has changed in appearance, it still serves to remind us of the toll of war.
The focal point in Springdale Cemetery on the Soldiers Hill is the monument in the center of the hill. It was originally dedicated on Memorial Day of 1870 and originally had a full life-size Union soldier with 3-band muskets standing on top of the statue of the base. But it stood there for about 106 years overlooking the graves of the Civil War veterans. And in March of 1977 finally was toppled over. In more recent years, the fallen Civil War soldier has been replaced with an eagle, which still today sits on the base, which was dedicated in 1870. And the 4 words, justice, liberty, equality, and pro patria, are engraved in the sides of that base. And in April of 1862, the directors of Springdale Cemetery deeded a 40 by 40 foot lot here in the center of what we now know as Soldiers Hill for the express purpose to be a burial site, to be a final resting place of soldiers who were either died here in the camps or returned here to Peoria to be buried. Well, in June of 1862, Corporal John Gingrich's body was returned to Peoria, and his was the first body laid to rest here on Soldiers Hill. During the next year, during the rest of that year, Elias Phillips, William C. Grubb, James Grant, and James Shepard bodies were all returned to Peoria and buried all in a row there on Soldiers Hill, and they were the first burials on the hill.
Blacks of that era did not have the same rights as whites, but on Soldiers Hill they were buried side by side with white soldiers. The only distinction appeared on the marker, as indicated by the abbreviation for U.S. Colored Infantry.
When this mound was dedicated in 1872, why, there was 4 cannons here, Parrott rifles that were given to us by the United States government through an act of Congress. They stayed here all those years until 1985, when a Peoria street inspector decided that he would like to use it in a reenacting group, and he purchased it from the cemetery illegally for $800. It later sold for $35,000, And now these other 3 cannons were taken off of the hill and sold by Larry Leach. We sued him and got the 3 cannons back because a philanthropist in Ohio didn't realize that they were stolen property, and he returned them very reluctantly, but he was glad that they were restored in a fashion that they were supposed to have been.
There are 2 Congressional Medal of Honor winners buried at Springdale. One's Horace Capron Jr. Capron Jr. was born in Laurel County, Maryland, 1840. He moved to Texas 1854 and settled in Illinois when he was a teenager, a farmer. His dad was a big farmer, out to Jubilee College. And at age 20, Capron enlisted in the Army. We don't have a lot known about him in particular, other than he was one of 5 children. He served in the 8th Cavalry, where he was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously in 1865. He didn't recognize, no one knew he was going to win the medal, but his actions, not only in the 8th Cav, but in the 14th Cav, were exemplary actions. And when he was killed in 1864, some of his fellow friends and officers said there was no finer individual than Horace Capron Jr. I belong to the Soldiers Hill group, volunteer. We found out or understood that there were 2 Medal of Honor people here, so we went to the web to start looking for them and found out that there were 2, in fact. And we found out that Capron, through the cemetery, found that he never had a stone, or as far as they could tell. In fact, they aren't real positive. It was within maybe a couple of inches. It could be either side where he's really buried here. Nicholas Gershwin's the 2nd Medal of Honor winner, buried at Springdale Cemetery. He's from France, born in France. He emigrated to the United States, apparently settled in the Lexington, Illinois area, where his enlistment into the Civil War was at about age 33. We don't know too much about him in particular. He was a carpenter by trade, entered the service, fought at Vicksburg, where he was awarded the Medal of Honor some 31 years later. And I think we find that pretty interesting. They called for volunteers for the storming party to try to breach the parapet at the breastworks at Vicksburg so they could siege the town, begin the siege. And there was 150 volunteers, all to be non-married. 300 people volunteered for it. Gershwin from the 116th Company F led his people as part of the participation. As I said, there was 150 of them involved. 78 of them were awarded the Medal of Honor. That meant that 72 of them were killed in the action.
Peoria's early cemeteries were presenting problems by 1850, including this location that is now a park at McClure and North Streets. Diseased bodies decomposed in the wooden coffins, contaminating groundwater and adjoining streams. Early embalming techniques added to the contamination because of chemicals in the embalming fluid, like arsenic. These cemeteries generally were located in the inner city, where space was limited.
City planners in Peoria were faced with multiple questions. What do we do with the filled cemetery where we can no longer use it? We have the danger of groundwater contamination along the riverfront. We have the noxious vapors rising out of the ground that were believed to be as hazardous as the groundwater contamination. Again, because medicine was not as advanced as it is today. And so we see The former cemeteries, the old Masonic ground, the public burial ground down on Lincoln Avenue, those were actually closed by their managers, and families were given the opportunity to disinter their loved ones' remains and then have them moved. The logical place to move them would then, of course, be to Springdale. Springdale, I think, fits perfectly into the general concept of the garden cemetery, or what historians today refer to as the rural cemetery movement. And that movement was to get cemeteries, graveyards actually, out of the populated areas and into rural areas. In the early 1830s, some individuals in Boston decided that it was very important to create an area outside of the city of Boston, in Cambridge specifically, where it was still rural area, so that they could dedicate a portion of that landscape to the interment of the dead. That would solve the problem of having the dead continue to be interred in the center of Boston, in the old churchyards, and at the same time it would create a more pastoral or scenic environment. And so we see throughout the 1830s into the 1840s, 1850s, the development in most population centers of the development of these garden cemeteries that would take advantage of the natural topography, would build upon the general romantic notion that was popular in Victorian America and England at the time of becoming much more comfortable with the concept of death and mortality.
Three landowners sold property to incorporate Springdale in 1855. All three are buried here: Thomas Baldwin, William Hall, and Hervey Leitner, who has the tallest obelisk in the cemetery. The rolling hills provided scenic views for the public to enjoy, with Sunday picnics very common. Some families avoided straight row configurations and opted for circular-shaped burial plots, another change from the traditional cemetery. The great wealth of Peoria's whiskey era created many large and ornate cemetery monuments. In all, Peoria would eventually be home to 76 distilleries.
As you walk through Springdale, you'll find Samuel and Jacob Woolner, Albert and Edward Lisey, Philip Zell, Edward Jack, Matthew Henneberry, John Gipps, William Hall, the Cornings and the Clarks, legendary names. John Francis made his fortune supplying millions of whiskey barrels to the distilleries. Edward Easton supplied tons of grain and corn, and Christian Bueller controlled the millions of cattle in the distillery stockyards to make his fortune. With tremendous wealth enabled the distillers to really build up our city. The distillers contributed all the money to buy the parks in the 1890s. They contributed many to the cultural life. Matthew Henneberry built the Grand Opera House. The Liseys built the Orpheum Theater. William Hall built the Palace Theater. Joseph Greenhut donated the GAR Hall, which exists today. And the Bergner's building was actually the Woolner building, where the Whiskey Trust had their offices. And of course, as you walk through Springdale, you can find the first distiller from the 1840s, Almiron S. Cole.
As the whiskey barons prospered, there were a few citizens who stood in opposition. One was Lucy Ting.
Lucy wore a white ribbon most of her life, and that was to tell people that she was very concerned about the abuse of alcohol in the community, all the problems that it caused. She wore this white ribbon to let people know that she was a member of what was called the White Ribbon Society in Peoria. There was a women's Christian temperance union group that was raised in Peoria. And later on, the White Ribbon Club was dissolved and became part of the Peoria Women's Christian Temperance Movement. Among the things that they did to help people, they offered gospel temperance meetings in Peoria for men and women both, and they also helped support very many evangelical missions.
There was also an anti-slavery movement at that time. Mark Morrill Aiken was one of the leading abolitionists, having moved to Peoria to look at some land he obtained in a military tract.
In 1835, he attended land sales in Quincy. He purchased some land, and he also met George Bester. And George and Mark went into business for a while as land agents dealing primarily in land in the military tract. Mark Aiken made Peoria his home. He continued in real estate for the rest of his life. He purchased much valuable land, some of which had coal on it, and he invested in coal mines. Mark Aiken served his community. He was an assessor. He served as school inspector and held other positions. He was a temperance man. In politics, he was first a Whig and then a Republican, and he supported strongly Abraham Lincoln, although he did vote for Horace Greeley when he ran for president. He was first a member of the Methodist Church in Peoria, and later in 1855 helped to found the Second Presbyterian Church. But Mark long identified himself with the Main Street Church, which was known as the Abolition Church, because Mark was a staunch abolitionist. The Main Street Church was organized in 1834 as a Presbyterian church, but became congregational in 1847. And Mark is connected with the history of its two historic bells. Mark Aiken rang the church bell that brought people to the Main Street Church for the purpose of organizing a Peoria Anti-Slavery Society in 1843. And this bell became known as the Liberty Bell, the first bell heard in Peoria for God, freedom, and native land. In 1857, the church had a much larger church building and it had a much larger bell. And Mark went to the church on the occasion of every Union victory during the Civil War, and he rang the bell. Mark Aiken also worked on the Underground Railroad, and for this type of activity and for his strong anti-slavery convictions, he earned the title of the Apostle of Liberty. Main Street Congregational became known as the First Congregational Church in 1875. In 1936, the First Congregational Church burned down, and the little anti-slavery bell was destroyed in the fire. In 1937, First Congregational and Second Presbyterian united to form First Federated Church. The Liberty Bell, the one that was rung on the occasion of every Union victory, is now on display on the church grounds.
A street in Peoria is named for Mark Aiken, one of 200 local streets named for people buried in Springdale. A state mental health hospital in Peoria was named for Dr. George Zeller, who began his career fighting cholera in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War.
When Dr. Zeller got back from the Philippines, it was November of 1902. Peoria State Hospital had already opened February 10th, 1902, so they had an acting superintendent. He came back and found bars on the windows and the doors locked, and he was very appalled at all of this, and he decided that that was no way to treat even though they called them incurables and unfortunates, that was no way to treat them. They were people just like all the rest of us. Their sickness was in their mind, not in their body. Dr. Zeller took the bars off the windows, and he took the restraints away, and he would hang them up when the people from the almshouses came in with restraints. And and he did an 8-hour day because he knew the attendants weren't able to take care of the patients sufficiently with 14-hour days. And he put women on the men's wards. He also did not like the name Illinois Asylum for the Incurable Insane. He didn't feel that they were incurables. So by 1907, the name was changed to Illinois General Hospital for the Insane. In 1909, it was changed to Peoria State Hospital.
Peoria's first physician also served in a war. Dr. Rudolphus Rouse was a surgeon during the War of 1812 and then returned to his city of birth, New York.
Dr. Rouse left New York and came to Peoria in 1832. And he, shortly after that, he built a building downtown as his residence and office at the corner of Main and North Jefferson Street, where the Commerce Bank building now stands. In, I think it was 1832 or 3, the state legislature passed a law that towns and cities could incorporate in the state of Illinois for the first time. And in 1835, then Peoria voted to be a town, and they elected a 5-man board of trustees, and that board elected Dr. Rouse to be their president. So then in 1857, he built Rouse's Hall attached to his building up Main Street, almost to the alley. And his office building and the Rouse Hall building were 3 stories high. And that was the place in its day before the Grand Opera House later in the 1800s. It was where, well, they started with a Broadway show with Broadway actors on their first night. And it was, everybody played there in their day back then.
Mabel Northrop Morrill was a national and international director of plays, mimes. She directed plays in Peoria and was one of the founders of Peoria Players. She was a wonderful hostess in Peoria, and she entertained the Peoria Glitterati. She began a theater in the carriage house on the riverside of Flanagan House Museum, which she owned and sold to the Peoria Historical Society in 1962. She had her own theater company there, and she produced plays and directed plays. The seating was about for 50 people. Unfortunately, the carriage house burned down, but she was the director par excellence in Peoria.
Another Peorian now buried in Springdale, Herbert Brotherson Jameson, made headlines early in his life. He led the Peoria High School track team to a state championship in 1893. 3 years later, he won the Olympic silver medal in the 440-yard dash while a student at Princeton University.
Yeah, when he graduated from Princeton University, he came back to Peoria, got a job with his father's company, and he was a very socially prominent young man. Ended up marrying another very socially prominent young woman, Caroline, and they had 4 children, born over about a 15-year period of time. And they had twins, were the last 2 born in 1914. But Herb had a very successful insurance business, and up until at least until the time of the Depression. He started having some financial problems, and in 1931, his twin daughter died. 2 years later, the twin son, who was a National Guardsman, was in his bunk, and the soldier in the next bunk was cleaning his rifle and accidentally shot and killed Tom. This one made headlines here in the Peoria papers because the family was so well known, and it was just a tragedy. And there were accounts that said that Herb Jameson just never got over the loss of his son, especially. It's been 2 years and so close. Herb had a tough time during the Depression. A lot of those things weren't discussed because they were very socially prominent family, because he was even president of the Country Club of Peoria at one time. But things just got a little bit too tough for him, and the headline, he made the headline for the last time on the front page of the paper saying that he had jumped off the Franklin Bridge and drowned.
Tragedy and triumph. Fortune and failure. Imagination and ingenuity. Nearly 80,000 stories are located in Springdale Cemetery. From those who led to those who followed, all of them now side by side within these rolling hills.
You have this melding of class and gender and social structure together in one location, so that by simply walking through Springdale and even picking one section, there are very fascinating stories that can be learned.
Production of Springdale, Memories of a Lifetime, was made possible in part by Tom and Emily Luthi, with additional support from Jim and Lou Baldwin.